welcome to UK and a Changing Europe, to another of our hashtag isolation insights. So if you want to join in the chat, do tweet along. We've got a great cast today to bring you up to date on absolutely everything that has happened so far in the Brexit negotiations, and hopefully on what is going to happen as we reach a Brexit crunch month in June. I'm going to introduce our panel, though as always they really need no introduction. So I have with me BBC Europe editor Katya Adler, who you will have seen dominating our screens through the last few years, having maybe a bit of time off at the moment now that the focus is all on coronavirus. But anyway, Katya is here to tell us what is going on in the view from Brussels in particular. Delighted to be joined as well by Times columnist and reaction editor Iain Martin. Then bringing in the academic expertise and heft, as you would expect from a UK and a Changing Europe event, we have our very own Professor Catherine Barnard, Professor of EU and Employment Law at the University of Cambridge, so available to answer every sort of legal question that we've had in. And finally, last but not least, our own rock star professor himself, Anand Menon. Anand, you will have heard over the past week talking about Billy Bremner, talking about Alfred Dreyfus, but now he's really got to get back to the day job and come back to Brexit. So those are going to be our panel. The rules of the game are that we've got, we're going to ask each of the panelists to start off just by telling us where they think things stand now. I've got some questions for them, but we've got loads of questions that you've sent in. So thanks to everybody who's sent in some really brilliant questions. Some of you all were of a like mind. So if you asked a question about COVID or about extension, I'm not going to mention you all by name. Some of you asked slightly more individual questions. So if I can find you on my sheet, I'll definitely give you a call out there. But hopefully we're going to cover all of that and have an extremely interesting hour. And just to sort of warn you, this is a sort of like a warm-up act, because at 1 o'clock, David Frost and Michael Gove are giving evidence to the House of Lords EU Committee. And then, of course, at 4 o'clock, we've got the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee. So we will finish dead at 1, so you can go on to parliamentlive.tv and watch Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost giving, I think, probably rather less enlightening answers, I think, than our panelists are going to give you today. So let's start off. Katya, you've been watching these negotiations over the last tortured almost 3 years. So it looks like a standoff. We had Lettergate last week of David Frost and Michel Barnier locking horns. So are we really in a complete standoff at the moment? Where do you think things stand?
So I think there's various things to bear in mind, and it's sort of encapsulated in Lettergate. Where are we right now? Well, I think we are where any difficult high-level negotiation would be at this stage of the game, if you forgive me for using that word. And that is kind of a lot of baying and roaring from each side, because we've had 3 rounds of negotiations only so far. And so each side knows very clearly by now what the other wants or doesn't want. Not surprising then that they've absolutely 100% identified where they're clashing. You know, and this is over competition regulations, in particular over fish, over governance of the whole agreement. So this in itself is not surprising. What is different here and poses a massive problem for these negotiations is the timetable. The timetable that's being imposed by Downing Street. They will have to make up their mind officially, according to the agreement signed by both sides, by the end of June, to say, do we want to extend or not? And don't forget, the UK had threatened, if they felt not enough progress had been made by now, they were just going to walk away from these talks altogether. Spoiler alert, I don't think that's very likely. The other side of it is COVID-19, of course. As I say, only 3 rounds of negotiations since Brexit. And that was, you know, the sort of negotiations were delayed because both main EU negotiators, David Frost and Michel Barnier, went down with COVID. Now, you know, the teams are up and running, but they're negotiating via video conference. They say they can do it and it's not posing a problem, but we know from negotiations, when things get really tricky or tense, it helps to meet by the water cooler or have a cup of coffee or maybe go around the block together and somehow start untangling. That is not possible in these current negotiations. The other thing that I would say to bear in mind is, just as with the Brexit process or politics full stop, we have to bear in mind when we hear pronouncements either by chief negotiators or by politicians, what message is directed at whom. David Frost may have written a letter to Michel Barnier, but the suspicion in Brussels and in many across the EU I speak to is, was it actually a hardline stance aimed at an audience at home to say, we're going to stand tough in these negotiations, and that in the knowledge that in order to reach any kind of agreement by the end of this year, if that is the timetable, there is going to have to be compromise, from both sides. So it looks like stalemate, it looks very negative, but I don't think we can make that judgment right now. And all of the predictions is for a very hot autumn again. And you can say déjà vu from the Brexit negotiations because we had that hot autumn and it ended in compromise. But again, talking to trade negotiators, they're putting up a warning flag and saying, we're worried that the EU and the UK seem semi-complacent about doing the deal at the last minute, blinking, whatever you want to call it, because what happens if there is a second wave of COVID in the autumn and the political leaders are completely distracted? What happens to the fact that what we're actually doing now, forget all the drama that led up to Brexit itself, this is where those difficult decisions are actually made about our future relationship with the EU. The previous agreement was about leaving. This is all about the future. If you voted for Brexit and you wanted sovereignty over the seas and over the borders, this is where you're going to find out whether you're going to get it or not, at least as far as a narrow agreement that one could imagine by the end of this year. I'll stop now.
Yeah, so Katya, do you get any indication that, the UK said when it was publishing its draft text last week, that these would give member states a chance to look at what the UK was offering and potentially to put some pressure back on Michel Barnier, maybe to think about changing his mandate so he could move. And even he seemed slightly dissatisfied with how boxed in he was on fish, where he described both positions as maximalist. Did the UK draft text unlock anything in Europe, or was it all overtaken by the sort of Frost letter and the tone there? And
I don't think things have been overtaken by the Frost letter. And what I do predict is that ahead of the next negotiating round, round 4, which starts on the 1st of June, and ahead of that EU-UK summit, I think we're going to start hearing noises from both sides about, we're not going to compromise, but we want a deal. And I think we're going to start hearing, more noises like that. Definitely EU member states were really annoyed, and that's putting it in polite language, that they didn't manage to get hold of the draft legal text before, and that the UK had said, look, this is for your eyes only, Commission, and that's because the UK didn't want a leaking of text. Now the member states have got it. We had just yesterday a meeting between Michel Barnier, the main 8 sort of fishing member states, and 3 others that wanted to listen in on the conversation. And it was the member states pushing the Commission to remain tough line. And I think this is something that we've often misunderstood in the UK. Often the Commission is portrayed as, the evil one. But actually, Theresa May and her chief of staff have said after, they left their positions, that actually Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier were often the ones who were trying to get, this is painting it in very black and white terms, and it isn't like that. But often the Commission is the one trying to get the deal. Michel Barnier gets his mandate from the member states. Think about France, Emmanuel Macron, and EU member states that are really happy to go in line behind him as Brexit bad cop. They want to make sure that their interests are protected in this deal. And as they keep repeating, it's not a deal at any price. What European businesses don't want to see, especially the ones that do most trade with us, is that we, the UK, get such a competitive advantage in this deal that we could then undercut them in their own market. This is something they're extremely worried about. No deal absolutely would be very bad for EU businesses, but again, too much of a compromise by the EU on this would be something also that businesses would punish their political leaders over, and those political leaders know it. One more final thing is to bear in mind, if you look at this from a pure economic point of view, it makes complete sense for both sides to do a deal, right? Especially, you could say, with COVID and the economies being decimated on all sides. Of course, we should keep trading together. But there's another big presence at this negotiating table, and that's politics. politics on both sides, and politics that both sides say actually overrides the economy. For a lot of Brexiteers, they said, listen, it's not about money. This is about sovereignty over the economy. And we want to protect our sovereignty, and we're not going to sign away our sovereignty to the EU in order to get a good trade deal. And on the other side, you'll hear from EU politicians, it's not just the Commission, over and over again, and to talk about the integrity of the single market. It almost sounds religious. It's political. It's about the European project and not just about economy. And it's also about saying to other member states, listen, you can't just break the rules and still get the good stuff out of us. Poland, Hungary, they might say, if the UK can get a good deal and they don't keep to the rules, why should we as member states keep to the rules? So, you know, that is in the back of mind as well, politics as well as economics.
Katya, that's incredibly helpful. I'm going to come now to Iain, as a sort of person who perhaps of all our panel is nearest the mind of the government. I'm quite sure he would thank me for saying that. One of the questions we had here, Iain, was from Peter Burke, who was basically asking, is this government actually serious about a deal? Isn't it really just setting this all up? And perhaps the David Frost letter was doing that to just justify why it walks away with no deal. So do you think the same as Katya, that basically they will keep on going after the end of June and aim for something in the autumn, or really would the government really just rather be shot of it and concentrate on some other things? Iain.
Thanks, Jill. I think after the events of the last 4 or 5 days, I'm not sure I'd be keen to be identified with the mind of the government. The government seems to be kind of out of its mind at the moment in the UK. I think it was a brilliant analysis by Katya. I would agree with most of it. On the Frost question, I think it was, as much as I can establish this, and it's very difficult at the moment, partly for the reason that Katya mentioned, that you're not getting the two sides in the negotiations are not having those water cooler moments, but then it's also much more difficult for journalists and for commentators, because the places where you would usually sort of pick up gossip, which is on the in the corridors and on the edges of meetings, in Westminster terms, in Portcullis House, of course, that's not happening at the moment. But as much as I can establish it, I would say that it was a deliberate attempt by David Frost not to play a game, but to point out the political realities to the 27 and to Michel Barnier, who I'm sure is aware of them, because I think the politics of this really matter. I mean, there will be people watching this who are completely baffled that Britain has not, in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the 1930s, asked already for an extension. But when you think it through in practical political terms, in terms of how the Tory tribe would view it, he has very, very little room for manoeuvre on this. It is simply not feasible, viable, that Boris would, and never say never. There could be a second wave and things might change again, of course. But I think it is highly, highly unlikely that he would have sufficient room to go back to the Tory party and say, look, we've tried to do this deal and the EU's sticking to its position and it's really just all a bit too difficult. So I have open negotiations about how we can sign a check and carry on following the EU's rules. You just need to say it in those terms and think of it being on the 6 o'clock news presented by Laura and Kunzberg and Katya to see how implausible it is politically. He already has a difficult situation with COVID-19. This would be to completely dynamite his authority in the Conservative Party, because everything about him, the way he's sticking to Cummings, his view, he knows that he is defined in terms of his connection with those voters that got him his majority of 80 as being the person who gets Brexit done for good or for ill. So I just don't think it is plausible that there's going to be a transition. I'm actually pretty gloomy about the talks now. There was a brief flurry reports, as was mentioned a moment ago, about the possibility of some movement on fishing. It turned out yesterday that the opposite is the case, and that actually the member states, coastal states, are asking Barnier to hold the line. So there doesn't seem to be much flexibility there. There doesn't seem to be much flexibility on a level playing field. So the calculation from the UK government. Now, this may be regarded as reckless. Personally, I think in the context of what's happening globally and what's about to happen to the global economy over the next 2-3 years, I think it's probably fair enough, is that the scale of the shock to global supply chains, to the model of the global economy is going to be so epic, and it's already underway, that Brexit, with or without a deal, is kind of a historical blip, really. And that, I think number 10's calculation is that what is going to unfold in global economic terms is going to unfold, and you might as well, in crude terms, sort of take the hit of something approaching a no deal Brexit. Now, we know from your report this morning, which I read with great interest on WTO terms, which some of my fellow Brexiteers have been very blithe about, as though it's such a marvelous arrangement. Why don't we just trade on WTO terms? We know that it's much more complex than that, and that there are downsides. But I think the calculation that they're making broadly in the middle of coronavirus is the economy is about to be shaken up anyway, and the difference from not getting a free trade agreement, they do still want a deal, and Boris still wants a deal, but if they don't get it, the difference is marginal.
So do you think they'll go on talking after June, or will we heard that the UK would assess whether there'd been, I think the term was good progress, by June to make a decision on whether it was worth going on and trying to get to an agreement, or to switch completely over to no deal preparations, having stood down that Operation Yellowhammer we heard about so much last year in January? Do you think that we'll see the talks break off in June, Iain, or will we go on talking till the autumn?
Honestly, don't know. I mean, they are, like every government in Europe, distracted. The main priority is COVID-19. One can imagine the conversation in government, and you can imagine the position that someone like Dominic Cummings would take in terms of walking away and playing a similar game to the game that was played with Parliament last year. Personally, my instinct would be that the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Gove, the Chancellor, would take the view that if the talks do break down in June, you try and carry on talking. You prepare as though there isn't going to be some form of patch together compromise or mini side deals or whatever could possibly emerge. I would be surprised if they said between June and December the 31st, you know, don't call us and we're not going to call you, leave us alone, we're preparing for the glories of WTO. I don't think that would be their position. I'd imagine that there would be a line open.
So, Katya, you want to come in?
Just very, very tiny point that we've already heard from both sides, that because things have not gone so well so far, both sides are saying that, they're going to have to look at their no deal preparation. So I think, considering that it's unlikely that the June summit will unlock every problem going, I think it's very likely that if they do carry on talking, which I think they probably will, that you will have an announcement by both sides that just in case they are going to step up no deal preparations. And that's also a warning to the other side, we're serious.
So Catherine, I want to come to you. We've had lots of questions about this issue Katya raised, that we might let that June deadline for asking for an extension under the withdrawal agreement go, but then find for some reason we're getting close to a deal but need a bit more time to conclude it or ratify it, or indeed we're hit, as Katya mentioned, by another wave of COVID in the autumn. If we let the deadline go in June, can we then still extend later on if it seems like a good idea to both sides?
The answer is it's really difficult. Legally, it's really difficult. I mean, what we know is Article 132 of the withdrawal agreement's explicit. The Joint Committee have got to decide, single decision, for an extension of up to 1 or 2 years. And that's got to be done by the 1st of July. Let's assume nothing happens at that moment and we get to October and more time is required. Then the question is, how do we seek an extension to the transition? Now, you say there might need to be an extension to transition to carry on dotting the I's and crossing the T's of any future trade deal. But it's not just that, because the more ambitious the trade deal is, the more likely it is to be what's called a mixed agreement in the jargon. And that means it's got to be signed off, not just by the EU and the EU Parliament, but it's also got to be signed off by all of the national and regional parliaments. So there's somewhere well over 30 parliaments going to have a look at it. And that's going to take time and won't be done overnight. And then there's a further issue. Even if we get the deal, it's going to require an awful lot of implementation actually on the ground by companies who are going to have to adapt to the new arrangements, because whatever the deal is, it will require quite significant changes in terms of trading relationships, and also training and indeed recruitment of all of those new customs agents. So there's an awful lot to be done, and all of that takes time. So how on earth do you do it legally? And the answer is, actually, it's really difficult. Various people have come up with various options. Some people say, well, look, Article 50 is the legal basis for the transition period itself. So we just sort of tweak Article 50 and we do it under Article 50. However, EU lawyers say, well, actually, Article 50 was effectively turned off on the 31st of January 2020 and can't be used for any extension to the transition. Other people say, well, what about the possibility of getting those heads of government together to have an international agreement to say we can extend the transition? But the big problem is extending the transition means essentially extending the status quo. And that means essentially it will be a mixed agreement. And therefore, again, you're back into the problems that I've just outlined before. So all of that will take time. Some people say, well, what about the possibility of using the Joint Committee itself? Can the Joint Committee, this rather little known organisation which is the group between the EU and the member states, can they agree to amend the terms of Article 132? No, they can't. The withdrawal agreement doesn't permit that. Bottom line is, really difficult to deliver legally. That said, don't underestimate the skill and initiative and ingenuity of EU lawyers, particularly those working in the EU. If there is a real political imperative and a political desire to get this done, there may be a way, particularly if you try and get the deal done and that deal in itself has a long transition built into it. So a transition to allow the companies, governments, ports to adapt to the changes. Now, all trade deals have transition arrangements appended to them. Most trade deals are about reducing barriers to trade. Of course, this trade deal will be about increasing barriers to trade. So it's a sort of unraveling of the existing situation, but nevertheless will require time. There'll be a transition built into any trade deal. You've still got the problem of getting all of those national and regional parliaments on board, including the parliament in Wallonie in Belgium that has kicked up rough over the Canadian CETA, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with the EU.
Okay, so it's looking a bit rough if we don't extend. So Anand, I was just going to come to you finally on this round, and then I've got lots of questions for you all. But does it make a difference? I mean, we're talking now about quite a sort of skinny FTA. So does it make a difference if we go for the sort of deal that the Johnson government's going for, or we just, as per the Now Trail, thank you very much, Iain, kind of changing your report out today, or if we just go and trade on what the government, I think, likes to call Australia terms without a trade agreement in place? What do we lose if we don't have that agreement in place?
I think it does make a difference. I mean, you're right that the gap between deal and no deal is narrower now than it's ever been. But there is still a gap, and that gap matters. There is more of an economic impact from no deal than there is having even what people refer to as a bare bones deal. I think in terms of Northern Ireland, the implications are very severe indeed. The harder the Brexit, the harder the border, to put it simply. That is to say, if we walk away without even an agreement on goods, then those checks on the GB-NI border become very, very intrusive indeed, and far more so than they would be in the event that we signed a deal on goods. And the final thing, the thing that I think worries me most about no deal is the politics of this. That is to say, if we imagine the talks break down in the autumn, both sides engage in a process of very bad-tempered mutual recrimination, relations between the two sides become very frosty. It's very hard then either to restart negotiations or indeed to talk about collaboration in a whole host of other areas. And this at a time when everyone is getting collectively a bit more suspicious about China and its motives and actions. Everyone is starting to realize that actually Donald Trump might not be the most dependable partner in international politics. And do we really want to be in a situation of a standoff with our nearest neighbors as well at such a time of uncertainty? So yeah, I think there is still a difference between deal and no deal with quite important implications.
So one question we had from Vivian West was whether no deal could be stopped. We saw Parliament frustrating no deal Brexit last year at various points, the Ben Burt Act and thing. Is that now for the birds? Are there any scenarios in which a no deal Brexit could be stopped? Anand?
Well, with a different composition of Parliament, yes, I find it hard to see how with a Tory majority vote, the one thing that Tory MPs have taken the pledge on is Brexit. They might argue about Dominic Cummings, they might argue about who pays the burden of any taxation post-COVID recovery. I don't think anyone in the Parliamentary Conservative Party is going to start arguing about Brexit. And I think implicitly they've all signed up to the fact that if there's a no deal, there's a no deal, and we'll go along with it, even if it doesn't exactly fill our hearts with joy. So with this Parliament, no, I think no chance whatsoever, to be honest.
And don't forget
Okay, I want to come on to some specific questions we've had. Tim Boswell asked, we were talking a bit about fisheries. I really want to go to Katya and Iain on that. He's asking, can fisheries really be a deal breaker? It's about 0.12% of the UK economy, a bit more. You might even double that if you add in fish processing. It's actually pretty insignificant in most member states. Will both sides really go to the wall on this? Katya, you were telling us about that fisheries summit with maybe Michel Barnier looking for a bit of wiggle room. Is it impossible to think of a deal on that?
Well, think back to Britannia ruling the waves. Think back to Theresa May and her promises about what Brexit will bring us. It's sovereignty over our seas, our seas. It's not an economic issue. This goes back to politics, but actually here also just totemic issues and kind of identity. So fishermen, or fisher people, I think is the official term. It's quite an emotional and significant issue that economically is not very significant at all. But it's the same for the French, and it's the same for the Dutch, and it's the same for the Spaniards. And so, Emmanuel Macron at his peril says, oh, well, don't worry about the fish. I mean, we know how passionate French fisher people are because, we often see that playing out in the waters. The UK says to the EU, you are total hypocrites because you say to us that leaving has consequences. And if we leave the membership of the single market and of the customs union, it has consequences. And yet you, EU, turn around to us when it comes to fishing, and you pretty much want us to act just as we have done when we were a member state, and for those coastal countries to keep their quotas. You can't play it both ways. Frankly, we go into the details of where both sides are kind of looking for cakeism in that front in the current trade negotiations, but this is a very fair point to make to the EU. But again, the reason that Michel Barnier has kept EU countries together so far over Brexit, and all of us who know the EU have been gobsmacked at this because they're going to fall out now over a restructuring fund. They fall out over, reforming the Eurozone. They fall out over migration. They bicker about the rule of law. And yet over Brexit, they've been pretty united. That is because Michel Barnier has this collective mandate and keeps going back to the member states, the representatives they all have here in Brussels, their ambassador to the EU. They sit together with Michel Barnier and they air their grievances, they air their concerns, and he tries to carry those over into the negotiations. There was only one point in the Brexit negotiations where EU countries were really annoyed, and that is when the Commission really did go into a tunnel with the UK side, and they came out, remember the famous Irish backstop, and it was going to be UK-wide. That's something that was hated in the UK, but actually Theresa May had come, had sort of pushed the EU hard over, but a lot of EU countries didn't like it. So Barnier has to keep EU countries on board. Those 8 coastal states, they have a very, very loud voice. And that makes fishing a very difficult issue and very hard as well for the UK to compromise. The UK also says, listen, you've done a deal with Norway over fishing. Why can't you just do the same with us? You know, we're only asking for precedent. We're only asking for something that you've already given someone else. And the EU always turns around and says, well, guess what, UK? You're not Norway, you're not Canada, you're not South Korea, and it is different when it comes to you. And this is where fishing is stuck at the moment.
So Iain, is that a deal breaker? Do you think any signs? I mean, after all, the sort of, you know, if the Cornish fishermen or whatever are cut off from EU markets, they basically have no business, there's no trade deal. So, you know, how do you think the Conservative Party ultimately will come down on fishing? Is it totemic for them, as Katya says it is for some EU member states?
It is, yeah. I mean, I spent some time yesterday attempting to read into the whole difference between zonal arrangements and various other aspects of what the sides are arguing about. And my God, it's quite difficult to follow. It sounds arcane, but let's be realistic. You know, throughout history, serious conflicts have started over less than that. So I think it is perfectly plausible that that becomes the principal sticking point or the main sort of public point of dispute. It's become totemic for Brexiteers and for the Conservative Party. It is just, it's actually interestingly, in terms of the fishing industry itself in the UK, which is tiny, there does seem to be, there's actually a bit more flexibility. It's not that there isn't, as far as I can see, the fantasy of total British control and no European Union coastal state access. And then meanwhile, Britain merrily sells as much fish and shellfish and everything to into the EU. I don't think that's what the aim is. It's really about does authority and control rest with the UK side on an annual basis and over those waters, and the EU obviously disputes that. The other thing to bear in mind is the Scottish election, which everyone is overlooking in all of this, but is the first major test for Boris Johnson next year. It's very, very difficult considering how well Nicola Sturgeon is polling in terms of her response to COVID-19. It is in the seats that the Conservatives hold, which ironically, many of them are not fishing seats, or they have a very, very small fishing industry. It somehow symbolizes neglect, arrogance from the centre, the destruction of an old, partly imagined romantic notion of a Scottish industry. So in seats that the Tories hold at Holyrood, they have to be seen to deliver something on. They have to be seen to stick up for the fishing interest. So I find the politics on the British side. The politics of the Tory tribe really matter here, and Boris Johnson is facing a very difficult test in Scotland next spring, and I think it's perfectly possible that the talks fail on the basis that the European Union won't move and the two sides can't accommodate each other.
Okay, well, it's almost pointless possibly going on with this conversation now if we're going to fall apart over fish, but I want to explore some of the other issues, arguably, which are possibly more significant for most of the rest of us who don't live in fishing seats. One of the sort of big areas, and I'd be grateful if any of you could tease this out. We've got a question here from Sitka de Groot about services, and we don't hear much about services. Theresa May was completely obsessed with goods, not least because of the Northern Ireland border problem. But services is, after all, our big export success into the EU, and the one where we potentially lose access. Good question from Siska about what progress has there actually been? She's heard rumours that there is progress on services, maybe the two sides getting a bit closer, but finds that a bit difficult to believe because so much is tied up with freedom of movement of people. Would anyone like to give us a sort of little update on where they think the two sides are on services? And I think in David Frost's letter, he made a reference to the EU failing to recognise the special relationship in services, or some sort of slightly weird language, which suggested that was an area where the UK was looking for a bit more than perhaps in a standard EU FTA. Anyone like to talk about where we are on services? Anand, good man.
I've not heard of progress, and it does strike me that the issue with services is it runs smack bang in the face of the two most totemic political imperatives of this government: freedom of movement and taking back control of our laws. Because unlike with goods, services isn't about tariffs, it's about your regulations and your laws. And cooperating on services is about getting each side to limit its own freedom of movement when it comes to its laws. Now, as David Frost himself said, the whole point of Brexit is that the EU doesn't tell us what to do with our laws. Now, if that's the case, it strikes me that it becomes very, very hard indeed to strike any kind of deal with services. A subsidiary point I'd make, I'm just building on what you said, Jill, is it is absolutely staggering, it seems to me, that since Theresa May first started thinking about her Northern Ireland backstop, successive governments have given so little obvious attention to what is 80% of the British economy, the services sector, that we've been quite willing to focus on goods, focus on tariffs, and not actually put enough work into sorting out services trade with the EU.
Catherine.
I would just add, I haven't analysed the UK's FTA in sufficient depth, but a cursory look suggests that what we're asking is not that much more than you find in GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. There are little bits and pieces where we've offered to be more generous, but the fact is we're starting from the low base of GATS, not from the high base of what's in the EU treaty. And so this is actually going to raise quite an issue for many small businesses who have currently just had the luxury of popping across to Paris to do a small bit of business. If they're going to need to get work permits or other things before they can do that, that will really be a significant hindrance. The other thing on services to note is, although we've asked not a great deal in respect of natural persons, the legal jargon for individuals, we have got an ask in the FTA on audiovisual media services, which actually gives the lie to what we're asking for is pure Canada, because actually audiovisual media services highly contested. And of course, financial services, there's a big ask in respect to financial services too.
So Katya, where are we on services?
I was just about to add there another big ask in the EU eyes that again is not precedent, is that we would like automatic recognition of our professional qualifications, and that would also help with services. And that's where the EU says we're back to cakeism, because that's not something that they've fully offered in the way that we're requesting it to anybody else. But I mean, that would link into services. Financial services are not actually supposed to be part of this FTA. That's supposed to be done in parallel. And that's where the EU is basically offering us equivalence. It's something that it offers to any third country, which is the jargon for a non-member state, but it's something that it decides unilaterally. And there had been talk about, and the UK would do it unilaterally on its side as well too, of course, that's something that had been discussed to be done by the end of June. But I did ask Michel Barnier about that at his last press conference, and he said, well, that'll be decided later in the autumn, you know, in parallel with other things towards this trade negotiation. Well, clearly, financial services is somewhere where the EU has leverage. So even if it doesn't come under this trade negotiation, it's something that where we can do it with fishing, the EU can do it with financial services and say, well, if you give me this on fishing, I'll give you this on, and so on and so forth. So these things are probably only going to really emerge by the end of the year. Another small point I wanted to make is when we talk about no deal and WTO terms, that's something that trade negotiators bring up again and again. On the UK side is, you know, the clue's in the name. It's trade organization. It is about goods. It is not about services. So if there is no deal, that does mean for us, who at the moment, even if in the future we were to trade in services much more with other countries outside the EU, for the moment, a no deal situation would mean we would not have that possibility at all. I think I might be joined by a child. No, I think that's,
that's fun. South Korea moment.
Yes.
Iain, I mean,
yeah.
I was going to say that the government does seem bizarrely uninterested in the interests of some very heavy tax generating parts of the economy. If you look at the sort of some of the income that we generate from taxation on the financial services sector is quite significant. Do you think it's taking too cavalier a view of the interests of some of our business sectors like services?
Possibly, but I would divide it into two. I mean, they're related and connected. So if you think of the big four accountancy firms, they are financial services, but they're also at the business end of services in terms of servicing businesses who are trying to sell stuff into the EU and elsewhere. I would say on the financial services thing, just my perspective, having written a lot about the last financial crisis and how central banks operate, is that I actually think on financial services in the end, I mean, I take a slightly different view from Katya in that I think because of, you just look at how much European sovereigns and European corporates need access to services in the City of London, sort of 80% of derivative trading, 75% of foreign exchange. You don't need to go through the list. I'm not saying we hold all the cards in that respect, but it is at a moment of, and I'll just come on to this in a second, moment of real danger for the European and global economy. That's not something you necessarily want to discuss. And I think that will happen, I think, at a central bank to central bank level, ECB, German Central Bank, London. I think there will be a desire, considering the scale of the potential catastrophe that there could be in the next 6 months to a year in the European banking system, which is going to be very lucky to get through the next year without a serious crisis. And simultaneously, UK has a sovereign crisis, just simply because it's printing and spending so much money, and the markets are very, very down on UK, and it could get a lot worse. So I think, at the peril of sounding like there's mutual interest there, it could go badly wrong. But I suspect Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England, Lagarde and her colleagues, and other central bankers in European Union will understand, on the crude financial services point, the need to keep things moving. So I wouldn't be too gloomy about that side of things. You pose a good question on business services more generally. I genuinely don't know why that's happened. I don't know why. Maybe it's because Northern Ireland just came to dominate so much in the latter stages of round one of Brexit. But for whatever reason, you're right, that is the case.
Anand, you wanted to come in quickly?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think it's partly because of the primacy of politics in this, that this isn't about economics, and the politics of regulatory cooperation are messier for a take back control standpoint than of goods. What I was going to say is, one of the interesting things about the narrative that shrouds these negotiations is everything is formulated in terms of dependence. So you depend on us for access to our waters, you depend on us for your financial services, but actually this is a relationship that is forged on interdependence. And there has been so little recognition throughout the Brexit negotiations of the fact of this interdependence. As Iain was saying, yes, we would like our financial services industry to be able to trade in the European market. But equally, there are lots of companies in the European market that are desperate to have access to the liquidity that only the City of London can provide. And framing this in terms of one side's dependence on the other misses out on that crucial aspect, that this is win-win and lose-lose. And that simply by saying you can't have access there, you're not hurting one side, because trade by definition is a two-way thing.
Okay, I want to move on from trade to a sort of slightly more neglected area, but it's one that still matters. Katya, I want to start with you. Benjamin Hawkin asked, what about security? What does the loss of access to the Schengen Information System, SIS2, mean for both the UK and EU security? Do the most recent talks imply that the UK will lose full access? I think both sides would recognise that it's in their mutual interest to cooperate on security issues. It's not as ideological in some ways as trade. There's not so much of an opportunity to do free trade agreements with the US or Australia, New Zealand or whatever. So where do you think we've got to on security cooperation? Because nobody really ever talks about that. Katya?
So I think, again, like with economics, it's quite obvious that it's mutually beneficial, but because of the politics, it's not so straightforward. So again, this is where the EU points to the UK and says, you say you want to leave us, but you're asking for member state access to our criminal databases and so on. And you just can't have that. And actually, Germany's pretty hard line on that issue. Angela Merkel is. You can't have the same benefits as a member state. And you could argue then that's cutting off your nose to spite your face. The UK has always argued that actually, you know, in many areas of security that are, you know, what we offer is superior to that in the UK. And actually, we all benefit very much from intelligence sharing on both sides. So I think this is something they will work out. I think the issue of how much access we get to the databases, that becomes very political, exactly because of the benefits of a member state. And I think this has not yet been sorted out. But again, I do not think this is something that these trade agreement would fall out over. And I think that when someone like Merkel particularly looks at the idea of a trade negotiation with the UK or trade talks, she does see it very much as the bigger picture. So while we may be talking about trade, or even now we've expanded to services, she's very much thinking on Anand's point there about China, about Russia, about Donald Trump in the White House, and the generally more insecure world that we're in. And she and the rest of the EU look at the UK as a like-minded spirit. So even though right now they're sort of all, you know, fighting over all of these issues, on the world stage, the EU would always like to have the UK by its size, realizes relations with Trump and so on and so forth, but on the basic sort of human rights values, on the environment, on security, foreign policy, and the world stage, this is somewhere where the EU hopes and expects really to be able to keep relating to the UK. How much is formalised on paper, and how much of that can be formalised on paper by December remains a big question mark.
So Katya, one thing could you just explain to us, because I've never really understood it, is it must be possible to do a separate agreement on security. And the UK is proposing all these separate treaties, whereas the EU wants one all singing, all dancing comprehensive agreement. Maybe you or Catherine could explain, why is the EU so wedded to the idea of one ginormous agreement with the UK rather than multiple treaties?
I'll just do a little bit, I'll pass you, Catherine, but it's, you know, we came up with this partly with the Commission, actually. They started talking about pasta, but it's if you have a look at ravioli, so little pockets, and then you can have, actually, if you, for your main course, you could just have one big one called the raviolo, which is like sort of this big pillow. It's a bit like that. So the EU basically wants a big pillow, and we want lots of little ravioli. And the EU's idea there is, you know, it goes to bed at night, and its nightmare is Switzerland, which is basically a whole series of mini deals, more than 150 of them, I think. And it's been trying for ages now to force Switzerland into one agreement. And that is because it gives it a stick. So basically, if Switzerland misbehaves as it wanted to over the freedom of movement, then the EU says, well, fine, then we're going to take away our recognition, you know, when it comes to financial services. It just gives the EU much more control, you know, over the whole structure of it. Because when you talk about governance, it's also what happens when one or the other party breaks the agreement in the treaty. And I'm now going to hand over to you, Catherine.
Catherine, why does the EU want one agreement?
So Katya talks about food. I'm going to talk about buildings. So the EU has always conceived of its treaties in terms of buildings. If you go back to Maastricht, you think about the pillar structure, and the way that the EU conceives the UK-EU FTA is based on one building with an overarching roof, which has the governance arrangements. Governance is the jargon for essentially what remedies there are, what happens when things go wrong. And of course, they want a governance arrangement which has some role for the European Court of Justice. What the UK wants is all of these separate agreements with a much more international law-based remedies settlement. So no role for courts, arbitration. And indeed, even if you look at the draft FTA that the UK has proposed, there are chunks of the FTA which won't even be covered by the governance arrangements that the UK is prepared to tolerate. For example, the level playing field stuff. So what the UK doesn't want is this overarching roof that covers the whole agreement, for the reason that Katya gave, that they don't want a repeat of Switzerland.
Iain,
and also,
sorry, Catherine just mentioned level playing field. I want to come on to this because level playing field is one of those things that everybody is talking about, that level playing field is going to scupper the talks. But when I look at the Conservative manifesto, what the Conservative government there said, that it wanted the right to diverge upwards from EU standards on environmental and social protection. I don't think the EU is very fussed about us diverging upwards. And the real sort of only sticking point really where the EU wants dynamic alignments on state aid. I just wondered whether you saw any potential room for a landing zone, Iain, on level playing field, or is that going to be, if we get past fish, will level playing field sink the negotiations?
Potentially. I mean, you've done more there, Jill, than most Tory MPs. You've actually read the Tory manifesto, which is highly unusual. Can I just say one thing, just very quickly, just on security, listening to the discussion? I think that there's an oddity. I don't know what the answer is here, but one of the strange things about this whole process is that it is possible that historians will look back in 20, 30 years' time and think that one of the most interesting and significant strategic things which happened was the binding together of the UK and France in the last decade, where the UK and France are now dependent upon each other and interlocked on defense, increasingly on security and intelligence, which was not the case until the attacks on France a few years ago. So there is the two states are moving to, I won't call it ever closer union, but they are integrated in a way which attracts very little comment. So I think the British will want to try and get a deal of the kind described, but are putting as much energy into those bilateral relationships on security and intelligence as a member of Five Eyes. That may be right or may be wrong. On level playing field, it's less totemic than something like fish, but I think to a lot of Brexiteer voters, it can still be translated and will be translated by Boris as, we've left the European Union, but they're still trying to order us around, and that's how he'll present it. So it's perfectly possible it will sink it in populist terms. If he is up against it next year in the wake of what's happened this year, I think you can expect the number 10 to get very populist in its rhetoric.
So Tony Totsi asked whether we saw any scope for either side to make concessions. Anand, any concessions you think in the offing?
It's very hard to see. Actually, Katya wanted to come in, I think, just before she had her hand up. So do you want to say what?
No, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to let Katya comment on what you said.
At the moment, no, I don't think we're going to get concessions in before the end of June. I think insofar as we get concessions, it will be based on a consideration of where we are in the autumn. We'll see where we are with COVID, what the state of the economy looks like, what the pressures from Conservative backbenchers look like. One of the interesting things in the UK is a number of polls have shown a plurality of voters seem to be in favour of extending transition. That's something that number 10 will have noticed. So before summer, no, I just can't see either side giving way. I think both sides will dig their heels in the run up to the summit in June. In autumn, who the hell knows, because things are so unpredictable at the moment. We don't know where the pandemic will be, where our politics will be, where Dominic Cummings will be. And I'd be reluctant to make a prediction, but I think it is conceivable in the autumn.
Katya, do you think the EU is minded to make concessions? Has it got they're very good negotiators in the EU. They've done this lots of times before. I think Michel Barnier and Sabine Veyand have a sort of plan to get us to a landing zone on this?
I think they will always have concessions up their sleeve. I think we could already see, as you said, Michel Barnier wanted to give way on fish and has been pulled back by the member states. But I think Michel Barnier, when he's been talking to these EU ambassadors, the representatives of member states, he said at the end of round 2, you guys have to start thinking about where you're willing to give way. But when you speak to any European politician, they say it has to be compromise on both sides. So I think the EU is open and willing to compromise. Where exactly and whether it's areas that the UK will find valuable is something else. The UK has said, for example, you know what, if it's too hard for you to give us 100% tariff-free, quota-free trade, because you're so worried about your level playing field, will take 98 or 99%. But, you know, then trade negotiators say, well, actually, that's not something that you can just do overnight. And that is then to forget that you're not dealing with the EU. That's when you are negotiating with 27 member states who haven't yet agreed amongst each other which one of them would give up access to which part of its market when it came to that free trade deal. The same would go for Boris Johnson. Does he turn around to beef farmers and say, actually, you can't be part of that? So whether that kind of thing can be done last minute in the autumn, or whether that would be the key, you know, so I would be with Anand. I think with COVID, with all the discussion areas that we've got, at stake, it's really, really too early. And however tight this timetable appears to be, everyone I talk to on the EU side says, oh, it's too early to really know where compromise comes in.
I've just got one very quick question for you, Katya. A scientist has written, Jonathan Jones has asked whether there's prospects of the UK still participating in Horizon Europe. Is that being discussed at all, or completely second order issue that no one's looking at?
No, you have multiple working groups. I mean, in the last negotiating round, there were 250 negotiators on either side. Can you imagine that? And they're video conferencing. So there are massive areas of negotiations going on. What I wonder is whether they can keep all of these tracks going till December if they are going to have a deal, or whether they have to say at some point, be it June, be it the autumn, you know what, we're going to have to forget track X, track Y, and come back to that at a later stage, even if the transition is over. I mean, when I bring that up, everyone goes, no, that's not possible. But, you know, I wonder, you know, research and development, education, freedom of movement, all of these issues, this is all part of our wider relationship. It isn't just about goods. This is about where Brexit becomes real and the future with our closest neighbour becomes real. And one thing to point out is that, be it the United States, Australia, Japan, or whatever, yes, they'd like to do a trade deal with us, but they are all hanging back first to see what our relationship with the EU will be before they complete any trade agreement with the UK.
Okay, moving right to the end now, and I'm very conscious that we need to end at 1. Just a sort of final, slightly odd question. Maybe starting with Iain. Would it make any difference if Dominic Cummings was, as a result of recent events, forced to leave number 10? Would that make any difference, the man who, you know, delivered the election result to get Brexit done, or as a Prime Minister trapped by his party, or steely enough himself to deliver it?
It's actually a really good question, and there's quite a lot of chatter you can see from social media and commentary among Brexiteers about this, because he's seen as, I'm not saying it's that they don't trust Boris, but he's seen as the person who delivered in 2016, Cummings, I mean, and the person who Dom's gift is for driving his opponents round the bend, so that they end up doing what they didn't set out to do, which is what happened with the election. So he just, whether it's a psychological dependency, I used that phrase in the Times on Boris's part, for whatever reason they feel bound to him. And people think that if, as a leading Brexiteer said to me the other day, if you take Dom out of the situation, then it's blancmange again, and the officials will get to Boris and blah, 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 the usual stuff. I don't actually think that that's true. I think the key personality is Gove on this, and the relationship between Frost and Gove, or the dynamic between Frost, Gove and Boris. And I think that they're determined not to go wobbly for the reasons that I explained earlier. So weirdly, I don't think it would actually make that much difference to the conduct of the talks. What it would do is make it less likely that you get some ludicrous blow up and some ridiculous piece of populist rhetoric, or sort of proroguing style inflammatory stuff in the summer, which probably wouldn't help anyone when both sides have got to keep talking. But broadly, I don't think his disappearance, if it happened, would make much difference to the UK government strategy.
Anand, do you want a final word?
Yes, I mean, on that, the fascinating thing about the Dominic Cummings story is it cuts across Brexit divisions. I know the government keeps wanting to try and portray this as a sort of Remainer plot, which I think the Daily Mail sits very uneasily inside that narrative, to be honest. But my hunch is that if Dominic Cummings goes now, it is because the Prime Minister has been forced into a humiliating U-turn and has to get rid of him because of pressure. I mean, the days when the Prime Minister will take a stand on the basis of his judgment has gone. If Cummings goes now, it is because the Prime Minister has been forced to relent. And I think that makes him less likely to compromise in the Brexit talks, actually, in a curious kind of way, because he won't want to appear weak again. He will want to show backbone, and I think one way of showing backbone is to act tough in the EU negotiations. So that would be my hunch, but as ever, I'm expecting to be proven wrong.
Catherine, do you want to say anything on this, or
no?
You can take the fifth.
Yeah, I won't comment on Dominic Cummings. I would just say on the effect on Brexit, but Dominic Cummings has actually been a strong supporter of universities and research, and so there will be implications if Dominic Cummings goes in sectors outside Brexit. Okay,
that's an important message. Katya, do you want the final word? We're about to have to switch off and watch Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost, the real movers and shakers, according to Iain, behind what's going on.
Only to say that from the EU perspective, leaving the customs union and single market is leaving the customs union and single market. And Dominic Cummings, yes or no, that is okay. What is on their plate.
So Brexit means Brexit. I think that's a great point to end. We seem to have been there many times before. I'm going to thank all of you for listening. Watch out for more isolation insights from UK and a Changing Europe. And for all of you intrigued by fish, there's an upcoming report. If you're intrigued by services, there's an upcoming report. There's an upcoming report on manufacturing, and do read today's report on what does trading on WTO terms really mean. So thank you all very much, and thank you very much to our excellent panel. So have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.